In the dark hours before dawn in Tehran, a mother checks her phone one more time. The currency has collapsed again. The price of rice has doubled since last week. Tomorrow, her son will graduate from university with honors, but there are no jobs, no futures, no way out. She lies awake wondering if her country is breaking apart. And the terrifying truth is that she is not alone. Millions of families across Iran are asking the same question tonight, and the answer they get will ripple across the entire world. By the end of this video, you will understand exactly what is happening inside Iran right now, why it matters to you personally, and what 3 specific indicators you should be watching in the coming days. This is not just another geopolitical story. This is a reckoning. To understand what is unfolding in Iran today, you need to understand something that most news coverage completely misses. Countries do not collapse like a house of cards in a single dramatic moment. They fracture slowly, silently, in ways that experts miss because they are looking at spreadsheets instead of human faces. And then one day, the dam breaks. What we are witnessing in Iran right now is that breaking. The slow unraveling has been building for years. Tonight, the unraveling becomes visible to the world. For decades, Iran operated under a structure that most people outside the region never fully understood. Imagine a city where 2 governments exist side by side. One is the official city council that handles permits and holds press conferences. The other is a shadow force that owns the power plants, controls the highways, runs the ports, and has its own private army. That shadow force is called the IRGC, the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps. They were born from revolution, hardened by war, and over decades they built an empire inside Iran that rivaled the government itself. They controlled everything from missile programs to wheat imports to the security forces that watched every street corner. Ordinary Iranians learned quickly that you could not breathe without the IRGC noticing. You could not travel, cannot import, cannot build a business without paying tribute to this invisible hand. And this is where the story begins to break open. The economic pressure came first, and it came like a slow-motion disaster movie that no one wanted to watch. When the United States withdrew from the nuclear deal in 2018 and imposed maximum pressure sanctions, Iran felt the weight immediately. Oil exports, which had been flowing at roughly 2.5 million barrels every single day, plummeted to under 400,000. Think about what that means in human terms. Imagine your entire city loses 90% of its income overnight. The currency, the rial, collapsed. Ordinary Iranians watched their savings evaporate. A family that had carefully saved for years to buy a home suddenly discovered that their entire life savings could not buy a single car. This is what sanctions do when they work. They do not just hurt governments. They crush the people in between. But here is what the economists watching GDP charts and oil export numbers completely missed. They were counting barrels and calculating percentages while missing the human story screaming underneath. The median age in Iran right now is 31 years old. Let that number sink in for a moment. A country of more than 80 million people with a median age of 31, full of young men and women who remember what things felt like before the isolation intensified, who use the internet every day, who see exactly what life looks like in other countries, and who desperately, achingly want a future they can believe in. These are not ideologues. These are not religious zealots. These are your neighbors. These are your children. These are 31-year-old people who want to fall in love, travel the world, build careers, start families, and live with dignity. When you trap 60% of your population in a system that offers them nothing but walls, restrictions, and humiliation, you are not building a stable society. You are loading a weapon and handing it to desperation. The protests began in September 2022, and they changed everything. A young Kurdish woman named Mahsa Amini was walking through Tehran when she was arrested for allegedly wearing her headscarf incorrectly. She died in police custody 3 days later under circumstances the regime still refuses to explain clearly. And something inside Iran snapped, not just at her death, but at decades of accumulated rage. Young women took to the streets and publicly removed their hijabs. A simple piece of fabric, suddenly an act of war. The slogan, "Woman Life Freedom," spread like wildfire across social media, not just in Iran, but across the world. The regime responded the way all regimes respond to existential threats, with force, with arrests, with executions. But here is what the security forces did not understand. They were fighting an idea, and ideas do not bleed. The visible protests eventually quieted. The prisons filled. The headlines faded from Western news cycles. But the rage did not disappear. It went underground. It transformed. Young people started living as if the old rules no longer applied. Cafes that had been segregated suddenly became mixed. Music that had been banned filled private gatherings. The regime controlled the streets, but it was losing control of something far more powerful. It was losing control of the future. The culture was shifting beneath their feet like tectonic plates before an earthquake. At the same time, something else was happening in the halls of power that the outside world rarely sees. The clerical establishment that has ruled Iran since the revolution of 1979 is aging. Supreme Leader Ayatollah Khamenei is 84 years old, in poor health, and the question of of succession has become urgent in ways that create visible cracks within the regime itself. Different factions, different power centers have begun quietly positioning themselves for a moment that may come sooner than anyone expects. Some want to maintain the hardline stance that has defined Iranian foreign policy for decades. Others, whispering in the corridors of ministries and security offices, are quietly arguing that the current approach is a dead end. That sanctions are strangling the country. That without some kind of accommodation with the West, there is no economic future. These factions do not agree on anything, but they all know that the old system is failing. And when powerful people realize the system is failing, they start thinking about themselves first. If you are finding this breakdown useful, subscribe now and turn on notifications. We track these developments in real time, and the next update could change the entire picture. Now, let me take you deeper into the story that they do not want you to understand. The regional dimension of this crisis is equally important, and it is the part that Western media covers least effectively. Iran has spent decades building what it calls the axis of resistance, a network of allied groups and governments spanning from Beirut to Yemen, from Baghdad to Damascus. Through the IRGC's elite Quds force, Iran trained, funded, armed, and orchestrated Hezbollah in Lebanon, Hamas in Gaza, Houthi rebels in Yemen, and a constellation of militia groups across Iraq. This was not just terrorism financing. It was sophisticated strategic architecture. Iran created a network that gave it regional reach and influence without having to deploy its own conventional military forces in large numbers. Instead of sending its own soldiers to fight wars, Iran sent money, weapons, training, and strategic guidance to local proxies who would do the fighting for them. It was a brilliant, ruthless, and enormously expensive strategy. And it made Iran the most powerful actor in the Middle East for 2 decades. But here is what almost no one is talking about. Maintaining this network costs money, enormous amounts of money, and Iran's ability to fund it is collapsing under the weight of sanctions and economic collapse. Sources familiar with IRGC finances describe a situation that is quietly unraveling. Payments to Hezbollah and other proxy groups have been delayed, reduced, inconsistently delivered. Hezbollah, which has been Iran's most important regional partner for decades, is facing its own crushing economic crisis in Lebanon. The Houthis have become a disruptive force in Red Sea shipping, but they have also drawn intense international pressure that is strangling their supply lines. Hamas is isolated, battered, and facing an existential crisis in Gaza. The architecture of Iran's regional power is developing cracks at every joint. Let me give you an analogy that might make this clearer. Imagine a neighborhood where one powerful family funds a whole network of watchers and enforcers who keep an eye on things from their perspective. Now imagine that family suddenly cannot make payroll. The watchers start getting nervous. Some might start looking for other patrons. Some might start cutting deals with people they were supposed to oppose. Some might go rogue and start creating chaos that no one can control. That is what is happening right now across the Middle East. The security architecture that Iran spent 30 years building is becoming unstable because the money is drying up and the center cannot hold. Nowhere is this more dangerous than in the nuclear question. Iran has spent years advancing its nuclear capabilities under international scrutiny and beneath the surface of diplomatic negotiations. But in recent months, something has shifted. Intelligence reports from multiple Western countries indicate that Iran has enriched uranium to levels approaching 90% purity. For those who do not know what that means, let me be clear. That is weapons-grade material. The regime claims its nuclear program is entirely peaceful, for energy and medical purposes only. But the technical trajectory is pointing in a direction that makes Western intelligence agencies very, very nervous. A government that is economically collapsing, culturally fragmenting, and facing an uncertain succession is now closer to nuclear capability than at any point in its history. Let that sentence sit in your mind for a moment. This is not fear-mongering. This is the factual reality of the situation, and this creates a problem for everyone. Western powers face a dilemma that has no clean solution. How do you prevent a country from acquiring nuclear weapons without going to war? How do you negotiate a new agreement with a regime whose internal fractures you do not fully understand? And how do you calculate what happens if those internal fractures lead to a complete collapse of order over a nuclear program that is sitting in the middle of the country? Here is what you need to understand about the human dimension that gets lost in geopolitics. In neighborhoods across Tehran, across Isfahan, across every city and town in Iran, ordinary families are making impossible choices right now. Grandparents deciding whether to skip their medications to afford food. Young graduates watching their career dreams dissolve because the only jobs available are in government or the IRGC. Women quietly navigating dress code restrictions knowing that every day is a risk assessment. These are not political activists. These are not rebels. These are just people trying to survive under conditions that have become unsustainable. And when analysts talk about regime stability and power dynamics and factional calculations, they often miss the most important variable of all: whether ordinary people still believe that change is possible. If they do believe it, they wait and endure. But if they stop believing, if the weight of hopelessness becomes too heavy, they either leave or they act. And right now, Iran is experiencing what experts call a brain drain of historic proportions, with educated young professionals leaving at record rates. Those who remain are making their own calculations about what the future holds and whether the risk of action is worth the chance of change. What do you think Iran does next? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. Your perspective helps us all understand this faster. While you are thinking about that, consider this next piece of the puzzle. Because the story does not end with what happens inside Iran's borders. It ends with what happens to the entire world. 3 scenarios are emerging from the chaos, and each one leads somewhere very different. In the first scenario, the pressure becomes unbearable, and pragmatic factions within the regime force a serious negotiation with Western powers. The nuclear talks succeed. Sanctions are gradually lifted. Oil revenues begin flowing again. The proxy network does not disappear but contracts because Iran can no longer afford to fund regional adventures. This is the most stable outcome, and it requires the regime to make painful concessions that hardliners will resist fiercely. The likelihood of this path depends entirely on whether economic conditions inside Iran become desperate enough that even the most ideological factions accept the logic of accommodation. In the second scenario, nothing changes and the paralysis continues. Internal divisions paralyze the regime. The economy continues its slow decline. The proxy network fragments as funding becomes unreliable. The nuclear program advances without any check. Regional instability increases as the various actors on Iran's periphery behave with less predictability and more desperation. This is the scenario that looks like nothing is happening until suddenly everything is happening at once. Think of it like the Soviet Union in the 1980s. Everyone assumed the system was stable until suddenly it was not. In the third scenario, an unexpected trigger, a black swan event, something that no one is predicting today, changes everything in a matter of weeks. Khamenei's health takes a sudden turn. A regional incident spirals out of control. Another wave of protests ignites and the security forces refuse to obey orders. Black swan events are, by definition, unpredictable. But what we know is that Iran is now a system under extreme stress. Extreme stress creates fragility. And fragility means that small shocks can produce enormous consequences. Here is what to watch in the coming days and weeks. 3 specific indicators that will tell you which direction this story is heading. First, watch the currency and the black market. The difference between the official exchange rate and what you can actually get for your money on the black market is a real-time measure of how much faith people have in the government's economic management. When that gap widens, it means people are losing confidence. When it narrows, it means some stability is returning. Watch for sudden spikes and sustained shifts, not day-to-day noise. Second, watch what happens with the nuclear talks in Vienna. If you see negative signals, if one side walks away, if threats start flying, that tells you the regime is choosing a confrontational path. If you see positive signals, constructive language, and willingness to compromise, that tells you pragmatism is winning inside Tehran. Right now, no one outside the negotiating rooms knows which way this is going to break. Third, watch the IRGC. Watch what they say, who they promote, who they arrest. The IRGC is not a monolithic organization. It is a collection of factions, interests, and competing power bases. When internal debates become public, when you start seeing contradictory statements from different IRGC officials, that is a sign that the elite consensus is fracturing. And a fracturing elite is the most important leading indicator of regime instability. Now, let me take a step back and tell you what this story means for you personally, wherever you are watching from. Because the instinct when you hear about a crisis in a faraway country is to think that it does not concern you. That is a mistake. Here is why. Energy prices are connected to Iranian oil exports. If anything disrupts production or shipping from Iran, if the situation escalates in any direction, you will feel it at the pump within weeks. If you work in any industry connected to global trade, shipping, manufacturing, or energy, the instability in the Persian Gulf directly affects your job security and your company's bottom line. The dollar's value against other currencies is influenced by these global tensions. And the nuclear question, however abstract it seems, will shape the international security environment that your children inherit. This is not hyperbole. This is simply how interconnected global systems work. What happens in Iran does not stay in Iran. It echoes across supply chains, financial markets, diplomatic calculations, and military postures in every corner of the world. The world is shifting beneath our feet in ways that most people do not fully appreciate. We are living through a period of geopolitical transformation that happens maybe once in a generation, when old orders crack and new realities take shape. Iran is one of the most important fault lines in that transformation. Understanding what is happening there is not optional anymore. It is essential. So stay alert, stay curious, stay informed. And remember that the headlines you see today are only the opening chapter of a story that is still being written. If you found this breakdown valuable, subscribe for our next deep dive. We are already tracking the next development, and it could change everything. The story is not ending. It is accelerating. And you deserve to understand what comes next.